Okay, all of the people in the waiting room are now in the webinar. Hello and welcome back to anybody who has been to our WTFs before, and welcome to any newbies who are here today. So whilst people are filing in, because it usually takes 1 or 2 minutes for people to actually get here, I've got a few announcements to make. Probably should start with some introductions. My name is Jamie Dobson. I am the founder, can you believe it? The co-founder of Container Solutions. We used to be a small company and now we're less small. I am joined today by my colleague Charles. Say hello, Charles.
Hello.
Oh, very brief. Charles is going to be moderating today's panel, which is about what is, or what the F is, developer experience. How many people from the US do we have today, Carla?
Well, almost half of the registrants actually. So, yeah.
You see, when we've got people from the US, this dictates how much we can swear. Because if we
No,
swear on normal amounts, anyway, so I'll say it once. What the fuck is developer experience? I've done it now, got it out of the way. And we are of course joined today by our wonderful panelists, Suhail, Crystal and Hannah. Hello guys and girls.
Hello.
Hello.
Welcome. I think this is your first experience with WTF. Fingers crossed, I make the sign of the cross that it's not your last, that you enjoy this and we meet again. Right. In the meantime, whilst we're getting ready, we have some housekeeping, some announcements, and then we have some gossip. Carla, who is joining us today with the gossip?
Wow, we have Rodrigo and Julian.
Rodrigo and Julian from Container Solutions will be bringing us the gossip. I hope it's good. I wonder if it's got anything to do with the falling price of sterling and the political catastrophe we find ourselves in this week in the UK. Housekeeping. We have a code of conduct. Carla will now post that into the Slack channel. So in summary, our code of conduct is that we need to be respectful and mindful of each other and all of our divergent views. We do enforce the code of conduct. So any breaches in the code of conduct will be dealt with swiftly and definitively. If you are running events and you would like a code of conduct for your own events, feel free to steal ours. You can use it, you can edit it, or you can speak to me or Carla offline and we'll see if we can point you in the right direction. If we are to create and maintain safe spaces in the environment, in the tech community that we're all responsible for building, we've got to take this stuff seriously, and you guys know that we do that. What else in the housekeeping? Yes, questions please into the chat. Charles will moderate later when we get to the panel, but any questions or clarifications, get them straight in. We'll come back to you either in the chat or if it's part of the wider debate, we'll come into you there. As we go through the gossip and the announcements, we will share all links in the chat box. Please feel free to use them, tweet them, etc., etc. Carla, did I miss any big bits of housekeeping?
Two things.
It's been a long summer.
Well, the first one is that obviously, as you can see, this session is being recorded and the video is going to be uploaded in our YouTube channel and the link is on the chat. Yes.
So if you've got a problem with that, then let us know now. You can switch your camera off if you don't want to be visible. If you forget to do that, let us know and we can pixel you out. If you've got a real issue with it being recorded, then you should probably leave the webinar and then watch it on playback.
And the second one is that we have the live transcription on, so you can also follow the subtitles live. Now, the live transcription is artificial intelligence, isn't it, Carla? That helps people who are hard of hearing or have deafness. Exactly. The question is, can it handle my Yorkshire accent? Because Siri struggles tremendously. So this is a great test for the transcription service that we're using today. Okay, thank you for that. Right, on to the announcements then. So WTF is a newsletter, it's a bunch of webinars, it's a bunch of conferences. We are not a spammy company. So you can subscribe to the newsletter and you can consume all the content without ever getting a request for sales meetings or without ever getting asked if you want the job or stuff like that. If you are interested in that stuff, just click the boxes. We're dead proud of not spamming the people who join our database, so you feel free to do this, and we make it very easy to unsubscribe later, but don't cry if you miss all the best content. The best thing that ever happened to me was somebody was really pissed off that they couldn't get access to the content, but they didn't want to subscribe to the newsletter. I was like, well, that's why we have this subscription service.
And all of our stuff is free. All of our stuff is for free. There's no paywalls or anything like that. And a lot of it is driven by the community. So some of the contributions come from us, but a lot of it is brought by our friends in the industry, sometimes independent writers, etc., etc. Speaking of WTF, we will be running our SRE conference next year. If any of you can remember back to the deep, dark depths of the pandemic, we actually had a webinar with Nathan Harvey, and it was called What the Fuck is SRE? And we got something like 700 sign-ups for a webinar. This then gave us the idea, if something's working, don't change it. This gave us an idea to do a conference about 12 weeks later, which we did. So quite by accident, we invented a conference which is known as What the F is SRE. There's too many letters in there for me. WTF is SRE. We will be running this again in 2023. If you don't mind following that QR code or the link in the chat box and let us know what you're interested in, we will tailor the contents and the agenda to make sure that everybody gets something that they need. So if you fill in that questionnaire, we'll be able to put on a better conference for you. Container Solutions is an awesome company. It's really awesome. Our management team consists of 40% female executives, 60% male. This is a number somewhere between the 60-40 that we're trying to get throughout the whole organization. It's diverse. We're good at what we do. Everybody loves us. I think everybody loves us. I think that's a fair statement I can stand by. And we're doing, oh, hello. Oh, a dissenter. Dissenter in the ranks. Someone's like, I don't love you. I just come for the free content. Anyway, it's a lovely company. And if you'd like to come and work with us, we've got all kinds of things: cooking, engineering manager, specifically in Amsterdam, even though we're actually a fully remote company, cloud native engineers. But we're also looking for 2 country managers. This is going to be dropped on the internet in the next couple of days. One to help lead our operations in Canada, and another to lead things up in Germany. If you're interested in any of those roles, speak to me, speak to Carla, or have a poke around the careers page. And on that happy note, oh, where's the gossip slide? Have we missed the gossip slide?
It should be there.
Oh, hello. Oh, no. Oh, the gossip slides have got, oh, well done. There it is. Now, what the fuck is the gossip? This was a feature we once trialed about 12 months ago, 14 months ago, and we were not sure if it was going to be a winner. And it was a winner. So every single time we do a webinar, we now have a gossip section. And the question is, who is doing the first piece of gossip? Is that Julian or is that Rodrigo?
Rodrigo.
Rodrigo. Hello, Rodrigo. Welcome.
I'm the one. I hope it's good enough.
What gossip have you got for us?
Yeah, so shocking. So Heroku is eliminating free access tier. For those who don't know, Heroku is the subsidiary of Salesforce, and it platform as a service helps many people with DevOps, cloud engineers deploying servers, allowing people to build and run apps. And you can measure everything like Go, Java, PHP, Scala. So after 10 years of offering like free services, Heroku's pushing users to paid plans. And who's to blame? Oh, well, quite often people abuse of free compute tiers for fraud activities like mining cryptocurrencies and setting up phishing sites. And guess what? That was the case, unfortunately, fraud and abuse. And there was even cases where employees from companies face several consequences because of things like mining Bitcoin at work. And that sucks, right? So the company officially states in their blog, quote, "Our teams are expending an extraordinary amount of effort to manage fraud and abuse of the Heroku free product plans. In order to focus our resources on delivering mission critical capabilities for customers, we will be phasing out our free plan, as well as deleting inactive accounts starting November 28, 2022. That's really bad."
The tragedy of the commons. We have something to share and for us all to use, and people who are mining Bitcoin fuck it up for everybody else. Okay, so they've been doing this for 10 years, free services. How many years after Salesforce acquired them have these services been for free? Is there any relationship between the Salesforce acquisition and this?
I think it has to do because now they have a bunch of competitors in the field. But the thing with abusing computers, it's really Wow. I remind when we had a customer on previous jobs that the computer was being hijacked and they were exactly doing this, like mining by Bitcoins in their servers because of weak passwords. So
Then with
I
the
think
day,
it's a real deal.
if only we knew then what we know today. Right, on that happy note, Julian, thank you for that, Rodrigo. Julian, second piece of gossip. I like the Heroku gossip, by the way. I thought that was a good one.
Sure. Hey, so sorry, it's not a goss like last time. So, but I'm still going to talk about something that I think people should be aware of, just in case they're interested. So today the webinar is about DevEx. Something we don't think about usually about DevEx is the personal side of it. So what I'm thinking about here is the ergonomics of where you're working, but also how you work directly on the computer. So concerning the ergonomics, we usually think about chairs, so adjustable with chairs with adjustable pieces or standing desks. But something we usually don't think about is the keyboard. The keyboard is actually a really important piece of equipment. And before, a few years ago, it was quite hard to get around a real ergonomical keyboard that would actually be useful and with a decent price. But nowadays you can have that kind of thing for a very fair price. And I'm going to give you an example like this. You can really go check. It's the Keyboardio Atrius. And this is, it has the shape of a split keyboard, but it's a unibody. So you have kind of an angle between your two hands. The idea here is to really have your hands be as straight as possible. And especially as dev, we are using a lot control keys for copy and pasting and other shift keys and pinky. We use our pinkies all the time. And I don't know if anyone has ever had that kind of pain here along the way or on the other side. But this keyboard, for example, will have more keys around the thumbs. So like this, you avoid all those weird movements and you use your actual fingers that are on the right side of the force. So that's part of it. And going with this, thanks to this, you can also have a really customized experience because you can really program yourself your keyboard either with GUI or with QMK, which is writing your own. That pain. I'm looking at the chat at the same time. So the pain is for everyone. So another part, the idea here is that you can customize it to your own needs because we're all individuals and we don't have all the same needs. The other part of it that I just wanted to mention is that you can actually have the same idea for your development environment. And this is something that a term was coined, which is personalized development environment. And what is it? It's the same idea that we're all individual and that we can actually have a development experience that is tailor-made to our own needs. So for this, I just wanted to mention that now there is something called NeoVim, which is a very good piece of technology, which is completely open source. And if you think it's too much and you don't want to spend too much time on it, there is a fork of it called LearnerVim, which is an opinionated, extensible, and fast IDE layer for NeoVim. So all of this to say that you can also really personalize your experience to have the best time you want and be less tired at the end of the day.
Absolutely awesome. Yes, your developer experience does extend to your physical environment. But what about those clicky keyboards that all you young people use nowadays?
So this is
my work experience.
This is part of the customize of the keyboards that I was talking about. You can choose the shape of the keyboard, but you can also choose the shape of the keys, and you can choose also the how the keys react when you press on them. So you can have some depending on your fingers, because we all have different fingers with different weight, and we can actually choose the right springs for you.
Very good. Okay, that's very, very interesting. I did not know that. So links to other developer environments in the chat box now. Thank you to Julian and thank you to Rodrigo. It's at that moment I'm going to hand over to Charles. Round of applause for Charles. and the panel, and we're going to start talking about what the fuck is next for developer experience. Welcome to WTF.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jamie. I do like to make these sessions interactive. We have had quite a few questions submitted already in advance, so I will cover off as many of those as I can. But do keep questions coming in the chat, and again, we can put those to the panel as well. Maybe you could start off by giving us a little bit of your what you're interested in terms of DevEx, and maybe a bit of what your context is, because that really helps us just to frame the conversation. And while you're doing that, I will ask the three panelists to please introduce themselves. So Hale, maybe you could start us off, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for the invitation to join, and thank you to everyone who's joined. Hi, my name is Sahel. I work on developer experience at a bank called Monzo. We are a UK-based bank with over 6 million customers. And for us, developer experience is really, really important because, if you think about traditional banking architecture and things like that, you've got to deploy systems really reliably and safely and securely. And typically that leads to really slow and really burdensome deployment processes. Many folks who work in banks are very familiar with a 6-month lead time in order to get any changes released into any sort of production environment. Change approval boards are plenty, a lot of human review and things like that. And essentially our goal is to eliminate all of that, automate that as much as possible. And we're now in a situation where we're deploying hundreds of times per day. And when I speak to my counterparts in other companies, they want to know the systemic approach in order to get to that world. And I'm afraid to say there is no silver bullet, but I imagine that will be a topic as part of the panel. Yeah, that's
great.
Me.
Thank you very much. Hannah, could you maybe do your intro?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, maybe to some. My name's Hannah. I am an engineering manager at Container Solutions. Previously, I've also lived life as a release manager. I've been delivery lead, all things in between. But I'm not an engineer, nor have I ever been an engineer, which is quite an unusual position for an engineering manager. I think that's definitely brought a different aspect to what developer experience means to me and my teams. So I'm really excited to talk about that a bit more today.
Fantastic, thank you. Crystal?
Hello, thank you for having me today. Also, I just wanted to say, if there's any cheering going on, the sales department's just out here. It's the last week of the quarter, so they're going a bit wild. I can hear them cheering, which is it's a good thing. So I'm a director of engineering at Sneak. I run the infrastructure group for Sneak. That's comprised of 3 teams today, which is cloud platforms, site reliability engineering, and developer experience. I've actually got my engineering manager Vlad here on the call today, I've seen. So say hello. He's the DevEx engineering manager. Why am I here? I have been a long-time engineer, so I've been doing this for over 20 years now. Worked in all types of engineering, but most recently, become way more interested in operations, platform engineering, infrastructure, and developer experience. I think I've done a couple of these kind of things before on developer experience. I think it's such a broad topic, and it's such a vague thing, right? Developer experience, it can be anything and everything. So how to bring a team like that into an organization and make it successful is for me something that I really want to succeed at, and happy to share what we're doing here at Sneak with this team.
That's fantastic, thank you. So given that, as you say, it is a very broad term, I wonder if maybe I could ask each of you to give us a bit of a definition of what you consider to be DevEx, and maybe also cover off some of the related terms we use, so engineering productivity, developer enablement, and so on. And there was actually a question that came in from the registration form as well, which is the differences between developer experience and DevOps. So maybe we could touch on that a bit as well. Crystal, do you want to sort of carry on with that one?
Sorry, sure. I'm keeping myself on mute just because of all the cheering. So when I went about setting up this team, this was the 3rd team in my group, so it was the last one to form. They've been going for about, I don't know, probably about 6 months or so now. But it's like the thing that I always start with is like the charter, right? That's really important to nail down. A lot of people might say it's a strange place to put DevEx, right? In an infra group. And I think, like, as I say to that team, like, it's a little bit arbitrary. It's just more that I have the background of having teams like this, but also this is something I want us to set up for the company. And to be honest, in my mind, I think it probably becomes its own department, its own group over time. And that's often what happens at organizations that are more mature at this, say like GitHub, where you talk about things like engineering productivity. They have entire departments based around that, comprised of several teams. But that's not where we are. We're a startup. We're 7 years old now. And like, this is our first foray into this. And I think, like, for me, it's like, it's really important to say, okay, to the company, we have 300 engineers at Sneak today, maybe a bit more than that now. And it's trying to, like, quantify and qualify to them what is developer experience, because like I said, that's everything, right? Developer experience is everywhere. It's at every part of the stack. Somebody was talking before about like the ergonomics, like how far does that go? And then we have things like operations as well. Like, you know, there's more things spinning up, like product operations, and how does that fit into the kind of holistic picture of things. And so for me, I don't think, so I bandied about a couple of terms, and I thought about things like you said, enablement, productivity, but I think it has elements of all of those things. And I felt like calling it productivity or enablement was probably not the angle that I wanted to go for. I wanted it to be called developer experience, because it's like, how do we bring that kind of joy and, you know, kind of day to day, like, how do we bring quality of life improvements to engineers and kind of move that needle forward for them on a continuous basis. And so it just depends on what that is as well, and how to fix that. So it requires like a whole systems thinking approach, because sometimes we might focus on the CI pipeline and how fast that is. And like, this is something we did at Sneak, which I can go into more around DORA metrics and the way that we're tracking that. But one of the things we uncovered during that process was actually the PR lifecycle was the thing that was causing the tension. It's getting people to put eyes on PRs and get that review done. That was actually the thing that had the lead time. So it's like trying to also uncover like non-obvious areas of friction as well, and reduce that over time. I'll stop there.
So Hal, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I very much agree with Crystal's definition, and that's the same approach that we go for at Monzo. For us, developer experience is everything from, you know, the ergonomics of being an engineer, like, you know, the tools that you use, the editors and things like that. You know, for us, it's very important that we standardize, you know, for the purposes of like security and audit and compliance and things like that. But we give enough freedom for engineers to go out and experiment. If you ask a lot of engineers in many traditional companies and companies that I've worked in, even in the past at startups, you know, every engineer has their like folder of shortcuts, you know, folder of scripts or whatever, things to make life easier for them. And typically, you know, those get shared around by word of mouth, or like, you know, hidden somewhere in some sort of like GitHub gist, or like, you know, maybe a Slack attachment or something like that. How do we bring those and make them mature tools that, you know, an entire organization can adopt? Developer experience can go even beyond just engineers as well. Like, you know, for example, there's questions that engineering managers want to answer, and, you know, engineering leaders want to answer, and things like that. How can we empower them to also feed into the picture without, you know, spending a whole heap of time setting up their entire environment and, you know, essentially doing all of the effort to become an engineer. For us, I think this is also like quite an early function, even though we've been going for a very similar amount of time to Sneak. You know, it's quite an early function. We've accelerated quite far into, you know, standardizing around deployment and optimizing CI pipelines and things like that. But I think it goes beyond that as well. So for example, you know, how do you work in your IDE? You know, if we've standardized around particular languages and things like that, how can we make that sort of joy of programming? So for example, I don't know if folks have played with GitHub Copilot, which is like an auto-suggesting, you know, editor experience. a lot of folks installed that and were like, this is magic. It is also completing my code based on context that I've put into the editor. How can we bring that joy to engineers at our scale, at a scale that is relevant for us? We want to bring that spark back for engineers. I just wanted to touch on one of the points that you raised earlier about the difference between DevOps and developer experience. DevOps is essentially bringing that joy into operations. So if I take a view back into the past, if you wanted to do things in an operational manner, like if you go really, really far back, folks were hacking around with bash scripts and trying to write their own bits of custom automation and things like that, SSHing into servers and things like that. And the DevOps movement has made that significantly more automated, significantly more iterative, things that you can share, things that you can depend on, there's been a whole heap of tooling around this whole infrastructural space. So it's almost like bringing the joy of developer experience into the world of operations. So I essentially see it as a subset of the world of operations.
That's great, thank you. Hannah?
Yeah, it's nice that we're all in agreement on this. It makes it quite a nice environment. I think, as Crystal said, the holistic aspect is about improving quality of life, not just your technical systems, tools, and processes. To me, DevEx is how we make what we're doing easier, a more enjoyable experience for our engineers. It doesn't really matter what the what is. It could be a product, it could be a project, it's whatever is the focus. It takes cognitive, emotional, and capacity pressures off all of the downstream engineers. I think that's the goal. And it's not just about enablement, it's about enjoyment too. As we've all mentioned, it's about enjoying what you're doing. And as Julian mentioned, right the way down to your physical setup. And does the sound your keyboard bring you joy? Or does it bring you anger? In which case it needs addressing. I think from the DevOps to DevEx comparison, to me, DevOps is a function and set of processes focused on improving the end-to-end delivery of engineering work. DevEx, to me, steps up a level and looks at it more broadly as to the human element of DevOps.
Yeah, I think that's great, actually, thank you. There's a lot of comments in the chat about the idea of introducing joy into engineering work, so that seems to be really resonating with people. Can you give us a sense of the landscape of tooling that your DevEx teams are responsible for? Sahel, maybe you could talk a bit to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So for us, pretty common bits that are included in this sort of team are things around continuous improvement and continuous delivery, testing pipelines, things around deployments and things like that. But actually, where I think the landscape is going towards, it is more towards observability around your systems and services. So not talking about metrics and logging, not runtime observability as your systems are running, but observability, how do your systems live? Where does the documentation live? How do you do service discovery? How do you determine that an endpoint exists and whether it's internal or external? How you should call it, how you should authorize against it, and things like that. Things that would typically be loose documentation, making that a lot more structured. You see that a lot with systems like Backstage, for example, which is a service discovery style of tool. And I see it creeping more and more into other spaces like machine learning and things like that. What kind of models exist? What were they trained on? And similar things. I've mentioned documentation. Bringing structured documentation, both generated documentation from the API specs, but also bringing some sort of consistency around documentation tooling to encourage better documentation and more enforcing some sort of structure, especially as an organizational complexity grows. And yeah, like, you know, it's like a conglomerate of all of these different functions. You know, I hate to sort of describe it as like the other team, like, you know, it's not just like, you know, a grab bag of things, you know. All of these are like focused around making the like, you know, organizational complexity lower for engineers within a large organization. So I think, you know, a natural question is, you know, at what size do you start developing such a function? You know, once you start establishing that all of these different areas are trying to solve the same problem, you know, it does make sense to start spinning up this sort of function and, you know, standardize on some of this tooling so that you can, you know, benefit from all of these optimizations from an organizational perspective.
Crystal, maybe, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, sure. I just want to expand on one of those last points that you said, Sahar, around, I think it's like, you know, a lot of the companies don't do this until they get to a certain size and maturity. And so I do think like a kind of sub 50 engineers, you don't really think we need a dedicated DevEx function here. Kind of when you get to like around the 100 mark, that's when like processes and tech and kind of the principles that go along with that in terms of keeping the bar raised, in terms of the ways that even the way those things are codified into your tools and your platforms, that's when it starts to break down, I think, quite a bit. And I think one point that Hannah made there too is like, it's not just about engineering, it's also about product in a lot of ways too. And if you have like program and project management, like how do these functions cross-functionally work together at a bigger point and scale? And as you go through those kind of inflection points as an organization. So that's like why for us it was the right time to do it. I wish it probably had been done sooner, but it's where we have started to see like breakdowns in that. In terms of things that the DevEx team does own at the minute, though, it's quite similar. Like anything that goes around the CI/CD pipeline is within their remit. So things that we use, Circle CI, Argo CD is kind of the key thing there. So you can, from that, infer that we're kind of largely using Kubernetes at Sneak as well, and a lot of Helm. And one of the things that's on the radar for DevEx this coming quarter, in fact, is we have built an internal runtime platform for engineers on top of the cloud providers. And we're trying to create a higher level API for engineers. Because right now, the Helm charts and the YAML files that sit in the repos, it's like, well, now I need to know all this stuff about infrastructure. And it's like, no. With 300 engineers, they shouldn't really have to know that much about anything, right? And if we get to the best place we could be, which is the Heroku thing, which is like, I just want to spin up a service. I don't really give a shit. I just want good defaults. I want you to tell me what the best practice is. Just do the thing for me. That's like the 90% case, or maybe even 95% case. And so that's where we're aiming towards. It's like create the higher level API and then get the service templates spun off the back of it. And then that's where you can talk about things like Backstage and it being a key piece of the kind of technology platforms that we're trying to drive at Sneak, and why this project from Spotify is so interesting and so important as well, is that we can drive things like that from it. It's like, okay, we have a good API. Let's just get the services spun up. If you have a specific need, there are extensibility points there too, so that you can kind of say, well, I need a specific database resource and I need it to be configured like this. So the engineers still have that ability to kind of have some control over what they're doing, where they feel comfortable. I think that's the key point as well, where they feel comfortable. And that's like a whole set of maturity steps that organizations have to go through. It's just a thing, right? And so that's what we're going through now. And yeah, I guess, like, what else would I say? I'm trying to think what else they own. There's a lot of things, but Backstage is one of the kind of key ones that we're looking at this coming quarter, and that's more like bringing vendor tech. So it's not like not invented here. We try to be very careful of that. So it's like, let's use something that's already working and made that successful, and like even bringing that to like bear things like scorecards or tech insights as they're called. So how can we drive some amount of also accountability into the organization and give them the data into the hands of every single team? So scorecards are amazing. So So if you don't know much about that, I'd say look at Backstage, look at scorecards. This is kind of our big focus for the next couple of quarters. That's neat. I'll stop there. There's probably other stuff that I've completely missed that they own and they do, but that's enough.
Oh, that's great, thank you. There's a sort of related question that's come in from Pavel Brodsky, apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name there, which is when creating a higher level of abstraction, how do you deal with the needs of the more infra-minded groups like data engineers, etc., that need to have control that's outside of the sort of 90 to 95% happy path?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I could quickly answer that. So when we built this platform, we kind of looked at it from a point of view, like there are layers to it. So we came up with 5 layers. And of course, the kind of ground layer 0 is like just how do you get an account spun up and kind of the basics around an account and the org structure within the cloud provider itself. Mm-hmm. And we'll eventually add things like guard duty and stuff like that to that process. And then you have things like networking all the way up to the application layer, right? And so at each point of those layers, there are extension points. And so one of the things that I say, like we had an engineer recently who needed a MongoDB resource, but cloud platforms hadn't yet created that resource for our platform. But this person came from an infra background. So we're like, do you want to write some Terraform? And we're like, here's our playbook. And they went away and did it in like 2 days. And then they told the rest of R&D at a demo, like, this is something we did. Hooray. It's super easy and super quick if you're comfortable enough doing that. But of course, we wouldn't expect engineers to do that. So like I think one of the things that we haven't touched on is like capacity. Like you can build a lot of stuff, but for a DevEx team, like in terms of the way it should look at its capacity, there's a lot that goes into education, pairing, consultancy, documentation writing. And so we try to make sure that there is an amount of capacity always set aside for activities like that, actually across my whole group. But that's one way we manage that, is like, if you're not comfortable, this is the way that we can help you and get you onto the paved road as well on our platform.
That's great, thank you. Hannah, do you have anything to sort of add in on this?
I really like the idea of the tiers, because one of the biggest challenges I've seen working either in a massive company versus a company going through scale up is the perception of what is an infringement on autonomy versus what is an enabler and takes cognitive load off. Mm-hmm. And culture has a huge impact on that as well. So what your culture of independence is. I think from a DevEx perspective and infrastructure perspective, it's just not seen as sexy enough. And I don't understand why, because I think it's great. But so in my experience, often like the sexy work is seen as that application development. So taking the load off from having to think about the how do we get to even having an application deployed, generally does work out okay. When we're talking about restrictions and autonomy, standardizing of that, teaching them how, this is where I think the DevOps feeds in nicely, teaching kind of software and application level developers how to enable themselves to the right degree, allows you a mixture of standardization with empowerment and autonomy.
Thank you. Sahel?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that Crystal and Hannah have mentioned. It doesn't need to be restrictive, but I think there's a slight aside to that, which is a lot of the times a lot of these teams sort of focus on the 5% edge case rather than optimizing for the 95%, and you sort of end up in this situation where nobody is winning. I think it's important to optimize for the 95% case, which is and as I mentioned in the chat, many engineers do not care about running infrastructure. They want to stay on the paved road. So if you make the paved road as swift as possible and continue and allow extension points to add to the paved road where necessary. A developer experience team doesn't sort of work in a bubble. Just like as Hannah mentioned about culture, this is where culture really comes into play, where folks feel like they have the autonomy to contribute to the developer experience because they're using it on the ground on a daily basis. They are the people. One of the things that I see is that the team that is working on developer experience, they can do as much user research as in the field, right? But they don't have a true feeling about what other engineers are feeling on the ground, the frustrations that they are feeling on the ground, especially as they are developing and deploying applications. So getting a good understanding and allowing other engineers to contribute and giving them that guidance and consultancy, as Crystal mentioned, in order to add their own extension points where necessary and extend on the paved road. It is a global effort. I see the DevEx team as just mostly maintaining this global effort. So for them, it's all about making sure that they're adding things that they can continue to support, and things like that. Having a centralized team to go to, but they are not the be all and end all. They shouldn't be gatekeepers. They should be enablers.
Yeah, to add to that, gatekeepers, not enablers, is absolutely on the point. Exactly that. I think there is also the element of how do you enable a DevEx team to be successful? And where I've seen it work really well is where it's almost treated like a product, who has end users, who you have to have a product manager who goes out, gathers requirements, understands how to prioritize, works with your technical leads to understand, where have we got a balance of quick wins versus actually this is a bigger piece. And the communication then, all of the responsibilities, as if you were going to johnlewis.com and buying a product, and it was your responsibility as the product owner of checkout to be understanding, well, how long does it take for my people to check out? And how can I improve that? What do we need to do behind the scenes? What can we do up front? How do we communicate those changes? How do we trial them? What do we measure success as? And that sets up then your DevEx team for success, because there is also the balance of they're engineers as well. How do you go to make a good DevEx for your DevEx team when their priority is making it a good experience for people downstream?
I think that's really interesting. We have a lot of questions around how DevEx teams validate the work that they're doing. So how you measure, what you measure, how you gauge the effectiveness of the work you're doing. I don't know, Hannah, maybe you could start off on that.
I think that's a really challenging one from a consultancy perspective as well. And I think Robel's also asked a really good question kind of related to this around balancing, how do we make this a wonderful experience for our engineers versus, but what do our users need? As in down the line, what do our clients want and need? What boundaries are we working within? And this is where I find it super important to look at the non-tooling priorities within DevEx, because I don't have necessarily control of what my client uses. I don't have control of how their pipelines necessarily look, but what we can influence are the other aspects within the developer's experience that can be a positive environment. This is our internal processes as a consultancy. It's the psychological safety you provide, it's your physical setup at home. But yeah, I mean, we're talking a lot about joy, being pragmatic. It doesn't always bring joy. So how can you lessen the burden in the areas within your control? And yeah, in consulting, that's a really, really challenging area. And you just have to hope that you also have some positive cultural influence within your client, but not always.
All right, Crystal, you mentioned sort of DORA metrics earlier, quite a lot earlier on in the conversation. Is that sort of where you started off in terms of thinking about measuring?
That was actually the very first project the team did as a team when they were coming together. They kind of were split off from cloud platforms originally. So that's where it kind of incubated and then got enough people in the door to kind of create that team. So I thought it was a fun project, talking of fun, like a fun thing to do, kind of more experimental, kind of kick off the team in the right way and the kind of mindset that they should take on for the long term. And, you know, there are platforms out there that we looked at, like, and I'm not going to throw too much shade at them, but like we looked at things like velocity, code climate velocity. And the thing that I found with velocity was like, I wanted to give it a try, had kind of looked at it in previous organizations, but I just found it really overwhelming. And I was going around different groups and Sneak trying to explain what it might bring. And the amount of questions was just like sometimes some groups are asking me more than 100 questions about what they were looking at. And I thought, this can't be good. But also the other thing that you have to, like, when you're talking about measurement, which one of the things that kind of put me off that platform a little bit was like, it seemed to suggest that engineering managers could then use it for ill, like in terms of performance rating, like how many commits is this person making per day, or how many PRs. I was like, no. So you have to be really careful that isn't the culture you're bringing into the organization, because that kills it immediately. So for us, it was like, it's not personal. And anyway, the unit of measurement is the team. It's not the individual. So that should always be the case. But like, we wanted to look at it even higher level, going back to something that Sohail said earlier, was like, for me, it was also about enabling engineering leaders and product leaders to make better decisions and trade-offs when we come to quarterly planning. Like, where, people talk about tech debt, and that's very nebulous and kind of not very quantifiable. It's like saying, here are some KPIs, here's some measures that can kind of tell us where things are actively going quite wrong today. And one of the things that uncovered, it was like, we had a gut feel about things as well. And like our CI pipeline, we have, to kind of explain, Sneak has a monolithic architecture, and we're breaking that down, as companies likely do, and moving to service-oriented architecture. But we already had this feeling that our pipeline was it's just around that monolith is terrible. But putting some actual numbers against it was interesting. And like also quantifying what is a failure case versus a success case was also interesting. So like we're saying, okay, if from our definition of failure, it's failing 80% of the time on the first build. And then we broke down like why, the reasons why, in a graph. So anybody could go and look at that, but also we could say, okay, what does this look like for this one monolith versus any other services that sit outside of it, and do lots of side-by-side comparison. And that was really useful, because that kind of said, okay, well, there is a lot of value in spending the investment across R&D to break down the monolith. And this is the kind of return on investment that we shall see. So this is the thing, like, how do we as engineers talk in business speak, basically? How can we quantify that and advocate for the work that we want to do? So it's like being able to put some measures against that was really important. And we kind of look at that pretty consistently. I think one of the things that kind of struck me a little bit is when you read the Accelerate book that talks about DORA, they're looking at such a large swathe of industries that I was saying, like, oh, we should put the quartiles on there, like see like where we're comparing against industry. Because I was thinking, oh, we're not tracking that well. But like if you push code to production more than once a day, you're already in like the top. And I was like, okay, maybe we need to move this into like where we think we should be, given that we're a cloud native young company, and we're making like 60 to 70 pushes to production a day. Like, what should that number be versus what is the book telling us to do? And that was a interesting takeaway, but only happened after we did most of the project.
Yep. So how, in terms of sort of measuring the impact of the work you're doing, how do you go about that at Monzo?
I think there've been it's very refreshing to hear both Hannah and Crystal's take, because we've tried many times to be very objective about how we measure the impact of developer experience, and I'm afraid to say we've always failed miserably. And you come to a very natural conclusion that it is quite a subjective measure. For example, if you speak to a lot of engineers, especially folks who've worked at Google, they will rave about the internal Google tooling, and similar for companies like Facebook. But when you ask them to pinpoint any one particular thing, so it's just everything. Like, they talk about everything behind the scenes. So for us, like, it's very much based on gut feeling, as Crystal mentioned, gut feeling, and things that we want to empower, right? So I think the wrong way to look at it is, how do we make our engineers write more code, right? I think it's the wrong question to answer. I think it's better to see, okay, where are engineers actually finding it difficult to write code? Or for example, why are my engineers not able to deploy on a Friday? Or why are my engineers not able to deploy, at like 5 p.m. or something like that? Where does that psychological barrier come from? Are they worried that they're going to break the environment, or leave it in a state where they can't leave it behind, or cause problems for the on-caller, or things like that. These are like psychological barriers. So focusing and zooming in on those, and those are like based on gut feel. Like that takes research, that takes time. I think we're as engineers, especially, we want to take the quick and optimized path, and say, okay, right, we're going to put a number to this, and the thing that is worst, we're going to focus on that. And there've been many valiant attempts, and a lot of them have ended up in miserable failure. Now, gut feeling also can end up in failure, and I can give you plenty of examples where that has been the case for us. But I think it's been good that we've tried and dove deep into the problem, and sort of spoken to a lot of engineers and taken that time to do that user research, treating it like a product that we release into the wild. You need to do that user research. You can't just look at a score. There's a whole reason why user research function exists for products, and I think the same needs to happen for effective developer experience tooling and teams.
Do any of you have any experiences where the sort of developer perception and the reality on the ground are wildly different? Crystal, you're nodding there. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I could maybe go first on that one. Absolutely. Like, I think the speed, like the speed at which something happens is typically one of the biggest gripes. A lot of times something is slow, right? And like, slow is a very relative measure. Slow in comparison to what? Like, slow in comparison to prior experiences, or slow in comparison to, like, how fast, like, you feel that this should be happening, or like, slow relative to the speed that you were expecting for a particular thing to run, as which makes you drastically unproductive as a result. There's a classic, XKCD meme, which is, my code is compiling, right? And code, if you use a compiled language, your code needs to compile, and there's relative measures of slow. So for example, if you're working on a project and that project is a very complicated project, but you're working on it for a very short period of time, you will likely optimize the slow compile times in order to get the, like, to not have to like reinvent the earth. But like, if you're working on a product on a day-to-day basis and releasing it many times per day, you will want to optimize the for example, the compiling experience or the deployment experience and things like that to make it as quick as possible. Either throw money at the problem or throw engineering effort at the problem. And a lot of engineers don't understand that for developer experience is a very hard team to justify, because they're not shipping anything that is like objectively towards company goals, right? They are one step removed. A lot of us talk about, for example, undifferentiated heavy lifting and things like that. If you look at a company like Amazon or AWS or any of these like different providers that provide a SaaS, their product and their goals is part of their product. They are building this product, they are selling it to you. For them to make it fast and add new features is part of the product offering, right? Whereas when you are team removed, when you're an internal team, when you're building it yourself, you are one step removed, and there is always an opportunity cost, because those engineers could be working on a product and it's difficult to justify headcount because you need to justify how much more is this going to empower my engineers, and it's a really tough question to answer.
Can I add on top of that from a consultancy perspective, when you are then trying to convince a client to spend more money on an intangible thing that will obviously improve your engineering experience, but it is going to improve speed of development, it's going to improve engagement and the intangibles, you're right, it becomes harder and harder as you become further removed from the direct metrics of this will turn over this amount of money and add this amount of value to what we are doing.
I think there's a difference between metrics you can measure in real time, such as number of check-ins per day, then hard metrics such as mean time to failure, mean time to recover. But the DORA stuff is also around how much quickly you can turn experiments around, and that in itself leads to a culture of psychological safety. Those will only be measured with trailing indicators: retention of your staff, employee engagement surveys, cash flows, profitabilities. So there's an issue. So Suhail, you mentioned that you've tried to measure this objectively. The hardest things are hard to measure and often can only be done in retrospect. And I think we should not kid ourselves as engineers. We're all engineers, right? So it's all about how many check-ins do we do? But you need to take a step back and say, well, what's that DevEx contributing to the wider metrics around safety, experimentation, and just satisfaction in your job? And we often forget that because we're so busy doing what we're doing on a day-to-day.
Yeah, I think it's spot on, Jamie. Thank you. Crystal, I saw you nodding to the sort of difference between perception and reality question that kicked this bit off. Did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that happens in a lot of cases, is the truth. Like, one of the things that I haven't heard yet is the kind of broken windows scenario where we become adjusted to things that are just slow or broken over time, and desensitized to them almost. Whereas newer engineers will come in and be like, what the hell? But we'll be like, this is the norm and this is what we've come to expect. Like the thing I was talking about, the monolith, like it bugs me a lot because like when I joined Sneak, it's like we had a specific, what's the word, working group set up. And I threw a person in it as well, to kind of say, okay, let's get this build time under 20 minutes. And we're like, okay, we can do it. And we got it down to under 20 minutes. It's like 18 minutes. And now here I am 2 years later, and we're saying the build time, we want to get it to under an hour. And I'm like, oh, so like, that's the kind of thing with growth, right? Like these kind of things become normal, but they also kind of get exacerbated, I think, a little bit. But I think like, that's why the door metrics project was so important to me, is because I could show them. And like, we were a little bit worried actually when we did that project, because we were like, well, from our point of view, these things are failure cases. All of these things, flaky tests, failures, that's a failure. Like we would say this all fails. If it doesn't, if the artifact isn't built and ready to be pushed up into some environment, it's failed. And so that's where we came up with like, okay, 75%, 80% of the time, it's failure. And we were like, worried to show that to engineers because they might have a really bad reaction to that and might start pushing back. But that's why we tried to be very careful about how we labeled things and sort of said, this is the breakdown. It's not just some red, green percentage, but here's the breakdown of what it is. And that also helps management too, like in terms of identifying particular areas where more investment is needed. And the last thing that I'd mention here is like building empathy is really important. So one of the things we're going to do with developer experience team at Sneak this quarter is making sure that every engineer on that team spends at least one sprint in a team that's not their team to try and see, because there's this thing called work as imagined versus the work as done. And look it up, like there's something called varieties of human work, and that's what it's the article's called on the internet. And like it again changed my whole way of thinking about this. But it's like, we need to know what it's like being on the sharp end and developing that stuff, like from an application engineer's perspective. Like, what do they need? Let's stop assuming what they need and figure out what they really need and where the highest points of friction are. Because that's what I meant like about like quality of life. What is going to move the needle? Like, we can't just assume that. We need to go and live that life with them and figure that out together.
Yeah. Hannah, you started to talk a little bit about the business of getting sort of buy-in to invest in developer experience in a sort of general term. I was curious if you or anyone else wanted to talk a bit about the whole business of getting particularly kind of executive level buy-in for having a DevEx function, for putting time and energy and investment into it.
I can talk around where it's been a struggle.
Yep. So I could do that too, but go on.
I think I'm going to harp on a little about this, but the difference often comes between product-led businesses and consultancies. So I've spent my career working in consultancies, and invariably we will get the buy-in down the line when things have started to go wrong, and we say, this will really help fix something that's already wrong, rather than this will improve and make things better in a way that you can't see straight away. I don't think I have a solution for how we overcome that within consultancy, other than starting to also look more at, well, look, the wider industry and successful product businesses do invest in this. There is evidence already as we take it to our clients, and we're also talking about improving their culture around engineering and delivery. That, unfortunately, from a consulting perspective, is a catch-up game. Maybe I'm a cynic, but it's very hard to be a leader in this kind of investment in intangible improvements as a consultancy. We are often looking to product companies that have done it successfully and say to our clients, look, if this is who you want to be like, this is what the direction you want to travel in, look how well it is already working. Please allow us to also do this for you. So yeah, I think this is why, like, I've also reiterated around culture is such a huge one. As a consultancy, we are absolutely invested in developer experience. We understand the impact it has without needing to go through the process of convincing senior stakeholders who hold the purse strings that that is the right thing to do. I think if you can set up a culture from the beginning within that company, you're already onto the right kind of path. And then it becomes a case of ticking the right boxes within your finances as well, to say, and using those metrics to help fuel that says, look, this is the successful thing to do because we can see it's successful without having to go through the pain of it being really bad first.
Right, yes. Crystal, Sahel, anything to add? In terms of exact buy-in specifically, maybe.
I think there is one key indicator that is pretty important, and unfortunately, it comes during when engineers leave. When engineers leave, you get this magical wave where they open up and talk about many of their frustrations. And one of the things that comes up pretty often, especially when you've not invested in this particular area, is the poor use of tools, the frustrations around getting things shipped is like a very common reason why engineers will choose to leave their particular area. If you look at a lot of the companies that have been successful, there is a correlation in their success where they've invested in engineering tooling in order to allow them to ship quicker, reduce the mean time to failure. All of this is part of the developer experience, right? Giving, again, removing that psychological barrier to shipping stuff. And as Crystal mentioned, all of everything that a flaky test, a bug that's crept into the code, a deployment that's been balked, right? All of these are failures, right? These are all like paper cuts that engineers will experience. And when engineers become accustomed to these broken windows, they will be less productive as a result, because there'll be a class of engineers who will be very blasé and just fling stuff over the fence, and there'll be a very different class of engineers who will want to be very, very careful, and that will ultimately slow them down. These are all trailing indicators, as Jamie mentioned, and unfortunately you find out a little bit too late, but I don't think it's irreparable. Even in every size of organization, you don't get to like a large organization say, okay, right, all hell has broken loose, and there's nothing we can do about it. We just have to survive. There are things that you can start, and I think the case is easier to make even at a larger organization where you have potentially some headcount available. You can say, this is an area where a lot of engineers are experiencing paper cuts. Here is some data, right? It takes a bit of gut feeling to identify. Here's some data to prove that this is a problem, and I think with these we can get this graph down and say, okay, right, with 2 engineers' time worth of effort, we can make 100 engineers worth of productivity. Is a fairly easy equation to sell.
I think metrics and trust.
Trust, yeah.
It comes down to trust that the experiments will be worth it, and trust that if they're not, you continue to learn lessons from it.
Yes, I think I'd add to that as well. If you can have metrics that relate in some way to things that the executives care about. So your average executive is not going to care about, I don't know, the number of times your application crashes or the number of outages there are or something like that. But if you can relate it to lost customers in a process or something that the exec team do actually care about, then it then becomes much easier to backsell that, I think. Sorry, Crystal, you were about to come in with something there.
Yeah, I think it's actually to your point there, Charles. So I mean, we had the buy-in, so I was lucky, I should say, because I've been in organizations where that definitely wasn't the case. So that's refreshing from my point of view, that there was trust. My SVP was like, this sounds like a good team to have, and he's like, like when I go to my exec meetings, he said, it can be a bit frustrating because, they'll have reports. A lot of them will have reports and data they can show, but he said, I, as the engineering leader, often don't have a lot of things to base that on. We talk about things like customer SLAs and uptime. And he said, but we all know that these are measures that are just not that good. And he said, so I would like to have more data as well in terms of how is the kind of heartbeat of engineering, and how can we make that more productive. And so that was good in terms of a buy-in. But one of the things that we kind of did was, so I posted a link to a book in there, which is how to measure anything, like finding the intangibles in business. And like I would say, go and read that book. It's amazing. It can be a little bit dry at times. It does talk about a lot of statistics, terminology, but not too deep. So anybody without a statistics background can get a good handle on it. But it's kind of, again, another thing that's completely changed my way of thinking. And so we came up with the cost of delay model at Sneak, which is like, okay, here is a spreadsheet. And we're not totally fixated on build time, but that just happens to be where we started. But we have said, okay, how long is the build? How many engineers do we have? How much do we pay them? And if we brought that down by X%, how much money is that going to save the business? So this is, I think, big, because I used to be a VP of engineering, and I think having been in my boss's chair before, it's like, I remember what that was like how to talk business speak, like how do we justify ourselves? And I think like engineers often find that tricky, like in terms of like talking the ROI and the business speak needs to happen. That's where the buy-in comes from, is being able to quantify things and to talk in that kind of business speak way. And so like we were able to say like, well, yeah, if we make this investment, we can save 500K a year, like pretty easily, which, like it doesn't sound like a lot, but at our scale then, which was like less than 100 engineers, that was pretty significant. Now it's way more. It's probably a couple million a year. And you think like that's just by shaving like 10, 15 minutes off of a build time. And so that like surely that justifies the team just by itself. It's like you almost have to do nothing else. But there's a lot more value that we bring, right? And so we're saying, okay, that's a good place. A lot of people understood that. How could we take that same model and apply it into SRE? So what is the cost of an incident? And like, again, sure, it's going to be ballparks and that'll get more and more quantifiable over time. But let's start with some sort of model that gives us a range that we can then talk to the business about. Like, why do we invest in, learning from incidents? It's because we expect this kind of ROI from it. And I think that that's something I would say like a good thing to kind of think about to take forward into any organization in terms of getting buy-in.
I was curious as to whether any of you have any thoughts on sort of wider organizational issues. So something from my own experiences, we tend to focus a lot on, getting our CI/CD pipelines really slick or being able to deploy super frequently to production. But perhaps that's not our biggest issue. Perhaps our biggest issue is actually the requirements we're getting just aren't very good or aren't very clear. Or maybe there's a problem in the product management process or something like that. So it's not really within the direct purview of DevEx, but as we've been saying, DevEx is kind of a wider thing. I don't know if anyone has any sort of thoughts on that.
One of the things that I focus on and I like care about very deeply is the creeping in of organizational complexity, like when it comes to like with respect to developer efficiency. So for example, very concretely, in many teams, if you want a system to be changed that your team doesn't directly own, typically you'd go and add it to the other team's roadmap and beg probably their EM or lead to prioritize your thing so that you can ship your feature. I'm sure that's going to be a very, very common, that's going to resonate very widely across this particular group when you're relying on someone else. And with a lot of the like advent of things like monorepos and things like that, that kind of stuff has become significantly easier, where you can go in and help contribute changes to other areas of the business, and things aren't sort of like hidden away, and the complexity is sort of self-contained in one particular area. But some of that still can be barriers to entry. So, for example, if a different team is using a different programming paradigm, or using a different programming language and things like that, you're still going to have that organizational barrier, where you don't have all of the context. So, for example, like we were talking earlier about the paved road, and the paved road can also include things like the programming language that you use, or how you structure your applications, where your code lives, how you define your HTTP handlers, how you communicate between services, and things like that. Anything to make cross-company collaboration significantly easier can drastically reduce the mean time to delivery in general, because instead of focusing one particular area in one particular team, you've got a whole swath of engineers who are willing and able to contribute across different team initiatives. Now that comes with its own potential problems, like around ownership, and every engineer wanting every feature under the sun encapsulated within systems and services. And that's a side that you need to manage to make sure that it doesn't become an onerous burden on the owning teams, but it can be a significant empowerment in order to reduce organizational complexity, build empathy for how systems are being built, spread knowledge and expertise and documentation, and allow everyone to contribute rather than just a small subset being gatekeepers.
I think you have to be quite careful. We've obviously talked about DevEx being very broad and holistic and incorporating a lot of aspects. You do also then have to be careful that it's not trying to scoop up everyone and fix everything. There should be accountability held on a strong product management skill set and function as well. Like, it can't fix everything. It's part of that wider one, but that wider company or project, and the checks and balances and accountability are a good thing as well. I know there's certainly been, I guess certainly within consulting, I think, I keep going back to the consulting, it's my frame of reference. There can be a tendency towards, I've seen a problem, I'm going to fix it. There has to be a balance between, I've seen a problem, I'm going to fix it. I've seen a problem, I'm going to call it out and hold the right people accountable because that's their responsibility. And everyone is working towards the same end goal, but doing their own functions and their own things within that. I think it's a really hard balance to navigate, but there does have to be boundaries to responsibilities, as broad and holistic as DevEx may be.
Yep, Crystal.
So this kind of comes back to something earlier that's kind of happening a lot in organizations around when we talk about product operations, and like there are other kind of sister functions that exist in organizations. And I think pairing with them is good. Like, we started creating this type of thing in our organization. And so, Charles, when you talk about, like, we can focus on some of the things that they feel more comfortable, they're within our control, right, as engineers. And some of it is harder. It's harder to debug because you're debugging organizations then and processes and cross-boundary function kind of breakdowns and stuff like that. But that's why I think things like when you think about product ops and DevEx, they could be happy partners in terms of doing that kind of organizational debugging. And so that's a group that we've started to pair with very closely. The other interesting pairing that we've had is like Sneak being a SaaS PaaS company. We also have DevRel. So we're trying to figure out how does DevRel function and how do we bring DevRel into DevEx, because DevEx is kind of like a DevRel function in a lot of ways. And it's so like, how do we marry these kind of things that could help us under one team? But also, it's not like that one team's going to fix it all because it's a small team. And if DevEx becomes too big, you're probably doing it wrong. And it's like, it's more about like, how do we pair with other parts of the organization to debug that kind of systems thinking approach across the organization. We haven't got there yet, I'll be honest, but it's an area that I'm keen to look at, because it's something that I've been asked about before. Is like, what if the problem is actually with, like you say, gathering the requirements? What if it's just not very kind of like, it's not very clear what we're building or why?
Right, yes.
And we build the wrong thing. Like that's very wasteful, right? And so kind of going back to kind of lean kind of thinking and trying to imbue that back into the organization. And yeah, so I don't have answers. I'm interested though, and maybe if you ask me again in a year, I'll have much better answers on how we've done this.
There are a couple of interesting variations on the question. There's one here from Tudor, and I've had a couple of others sent to me privately as well, which I'll try and sort of merge these together. So it's basically down to what are the pros and cons of having a dedicated function for developer experience versus embedding DevEx people in stream-aligned dev teams. That's probably the easiest way to summarize.
I could start. So I'm really interested in stuff like this. I take things like team topologies really seriously, because it's like, you know, how you set up your organization is fundamental, the operating model. And so there probably are pros and cons. I think, like, from my own experience, I've tried different models for different things. One thing I'd say is, like, it's not one size fits all. Like, what I have seen work well is when you have more kind of core teams like this, like there's sort of 6-7 engineers around this with a product manager, is that doesn't mean that they do all of it. That's where communities of practice and guilds really help organizations function at large. We have that here at Sneak. So, like, while I might be running an infra function, there are a lot of infra engineers spread across the organization and people from SRE backgrounds. And it's like, so by way of, you know, introducing something like a guild, you can still give them like a kind of a stronger voice for like influencing the direction of where those practices or that platform or whatever it may be, like where that goes, and maybe even joining on kind of like a fast track. Okay, this is going to be a bit of a bumpy ride, but you're kind of our design partner because you're on the other side, but you also understand our context because you've done this type of role before. So I think that can be quite a good bridge. But yeah, maybe the other two have more to say on this.
I can go next. I don't think the two are in contest. Like, I think you can have a developer experience function which is a bit more holistic. And I guess what we call production engineers, you know, folks who sit within their individual teams and help sort of feed back into the general developer experience function, but also are optimized for their local group. And I think that sort of last bit is key, because if you only have, I guess, what we call the production engineer, folks who are sort of like hyper optimized within their particular group, if you look at team topologies and things like that, they're considered headcount of the owning team. And so, like, you know, their priority is first their owning team. So for example, if you've got a large cross-cutting change or something that could benefit many teams, the typical response is to like deprioritize that in order to get the quick and dirty variant going to make your team quicker. So there's no one really looking after the holistic picture. Where a developer experience team can excel is, their remit is to look at the holistic picture. But the two don't need to be in contest. Like, one question that's come up, which is quite similar, is, this developer experience, how do you build that empathy? And sitting and embedding with the teams and understanding how they work is a core function of being an efficient developer experience team. Understanding how engineers are building and writing software. You might end up in a situation where you're only impacting one particular team, and that is entirely okay. But you might find that, because you have a broader remit, you empower a larger group of engineers rather than just your localized team.
Hannah, do you want to comment on this?
I completely agree. I think sometimes we see the team direction as linear, but actually, particularly when you're thinking about your live service team, your production team, and then your DevEx team that you might traditionally place at either end of the end-to-end scale, it's not, it's circular. And actually having them close makes all of the rest of the circle flow better.
So how do you see the developer experience function evolving over time?
think we've had a lot of chat in the chat about, well, what does it look like in terms of integration into teams versus kind of the protection of their own time to make sure that they can do that and not get sucked into the day-to-day. I think it has to come down to the environment. Where does it work? What is the company set up like to succeed? Do you have full capability teams and that's the norm and they own sections of product? Do you have product teams who own very succinct pieces and need very succinct skills? You have to be able to flex. And I think the future of it is that we're better at articulating the importance of it so that it becomes a non-negotiable, but we're able to flex how we implement it based on the needs of the company, the project, the culture.
Yeah, I agree. I think the whole like movement, the whole developer experience movement is experiencing a bit of an explosion, and there's a lot of things that are like coming into the world of developer experience. So something I'm particularly keen on is the like amount of things we're able to offload from a security perspective onto the general like day-to-day work. There's a me and Chris didn't have a chat about this at all, but like things like Sneak, we're able to embed that as part of the PR process, for example, right? And sort of spread the whole like security awareness about having vulnerable dependencies and introducing dependencies which don't meet license requirements. Things that would typically be like a burden. Someone who do an audit once a year is like, oh, here's 10 violations of GPL that you're doing by accident. Those sorts of tools are becoming more and more ubiquitous, and a lot of companies are now like really talking about the developer experience. It's like a fun and sexy area to be in, right? A lot of teams are talking about their lived experiences. We're having conversations like this. I think is a good testament, and we're able to share some of these learnings and some of our experiences, things that have worked well, things that haven't worked well in our various industries. Even in areas like which have been traditionally very, very conservative, like I speak to a lot of investment banks and things like that. The engineers that are joining those companies now, they are expecting that level of developer experience tooling to be there. An engineer that's joining Goldman Sachs is no longer going to tolerate Java 5 being their standard development environment. So these things are maturing a lot. A lot of engineers are very in tune with what the industry is saying, and they don't want to be lagging behind. They want to be able to be alongside the big development forces like the Googles and the Facebooks and things like that. And the fact that we're having these conversations, engineers are very, very keen to stay up to date, more so now than ever. And developer experience is a very, very large part of that. And yeah, we're able to share our experiences.
Crystal, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just to add on to that. So like when I think back to when I started, right, like I don't think it's rose tinted glasses to say those were easier days, those were easier times. It's like, FTPing something to a server and hoping that stuff's not going to go wrong. And if it does, you'll just FTP over the top of it. And there was no source control. Or I definitely didn't use it. It probably existed by that point, but that wasn't very common. And so like, it's just so hard to stay on top of things nowadays. Like I just ended up doing something in the office here last week around a whole bunch of people on a accelerated kind of boot camp course. And like, what is it like to join the industry? And, for them, it's tough. Like they are expected to know all this stuff. And it's way more than I was expected to know coming in as a computer science graduate. And so I think like it is about paved roads. It is what Suhail was saying there. Like engineers just have a higher standard of like what they expect from their environment and day-to-day work. They're not going to put up with shit like they used to. It's like they have 1,000 options to go and work somewhere else. So it's kind of like from a brand and an employee attraction point of view, we need to invest in this. And it's something that can kind of set us apart in a big way from our competitors as well. Where it's going, I think we're just going to see more of it, is the truth. I don't honestly know what it will look like in the future. Like I said, from my own perspective, we have one team doing this right now at Sneak. I think eventually it becomes multiple teams, is the truth, with kind of more specialization, but also carrying on partnering with other parts of the organization and other functional areas to try and look at how we do this kind of more holistically.
I think that's actually a really, really nice point to wrap this up. So huge thanks to my three panelists, Hannah, Crystal and Sahil. Thank you very, very much indeed for taking the time to join us this afternoon. And for everybody we've had some great conversations going on in the chat kind of concurrently, which has been terrific. So thank you very much for this. As we said at the top, the session is recorded, so there will be a video published very, very soon. So you can look out for that. If there's anything you want to miss, anything you missed that you want to go back and look at, then that will obviously be in the audio and you can share that around. Carla, are there any other last minute notices, things to say before we close?
No, everybody who registered is going to receive an email with the video and some extra content that you can check out. And yes, if you like more of it, I put a reminder on the chat. You can subscribe to our newsletter or come to our conference in person next year, even better. I just want to thank you as well, Charles, for facilitating this panel, and our panelists as well. I think it's been a great conversation with a lot of insights. We'll try to answer some of the questions that came through registration via email. There were a lot of them. We'll do our best. But yes, thank you everybody for joining us today. It's been a blast.
Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
See
you.
ya.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye, guys.